most respected Professor George Cardona, the senior most Sanskrit scholar in our midst. My association with Professor George Cardona was more than 30 years, 3 decades. And he was my guest in Shankaracharya University as a guest professor. I could appoint him for more than 1 month as a professor, a visiting professor in my department. And I could see him in his university in Pennsylvania while I was on travel in the US. Professor George Cardona needs no what we call introduction, because his contributions are so what we call well known and recognized. I welcome Professor George Cardona to this August Assembly of Scholars on virtual platform and to speak on Panini and Vedanga VYAKARANA.
Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Yenakshara samamnayam adhigamya maheshwarat kritsnam vyakaranam proktam tasmai paninaye namaha. Yena dhauta girah punsam vimalai śabdavaribhihi tamascha jnanajam bhinnam tasmai paninaye namaha. Bhakyakaram vararuchim bhashyakaram Patanjalim Paninin sutrakarancha pranatosmi munitrayam. Friends, colleagues, guests, I am honored to have been invited by Professor P.C. Murli Madhavan as a guest of honor during this function, and I'm grateful to him for agreeing to schedule me for today instead of Friday, as was originally planned, and I could not make it. Professor Murli Madhavan asked that I speak on the topic of Panini and the Vedanga VYAKARANA, and I acceded to his request, although the topic is one that has occupied scholars for centuries, even millennia, and there is little that I can add that is absolutely new. I can only echo Jayanta Bhatta when he says, Kutova nutanam vastu bhaktum vayam utprekshitum kshamaha vacho vinyasa vaichitriya matramatra vicharyatam. Nevertheless, and being absolutely unable to match Jayanta's style and wit, I consider the subject important in the history of Indian thought and its Vedic foundations, so that it is worthwhile to consider once more what ancient scholars had to say, bringing out aspects not emphasized before. 2 verses of the Panini śikṣā, which predates Bhartrihari, correlate the 6 Vedangas with parts of the body, and Vyakarana is given chief status. Chandaḥ padotu vedasya hastau kalpotha patyate jyotiṣām ayanam chakshur niruktam shrotra muchyate śikṣā ghranam tu vedasya mukham vyakaranam smritam tasmat sangamadhityeva brahmaloke mahiyate. This emphasizes the oneness of the Vedanga, of the Vedangas, and that they all contribute to the knowledge of one entity in different ways. And 3 of these Vedangas are most intimately connected with language as such: śikṣā, Vyakarana, and nirukta. The domains of these are well known and described in various texts. I need not to quote here. It is noteworthy that Haradatta Mishra, the commentator on the Kashika, says that śikṣā makes known the way one should pronounce mantras both at the time of studying and during the performance of rituals. Śikṣāpi adhyayana kale karmani cha mantranam charana prakaram pratipadayati. This links śikṣā intimately with Vedic usage. Nevertheless, we also see an early generalization of this knowledge, so that śikṣā deals not only with Vedic pronunciation, but with the properties of sounds in general, not with respect to any particular Vedic work. This is already true of the Apishala śikṣā. Moreover, two texts that are most intimately connected with the Veda, two Pratishakyas, the Taitiriya Pratishakya of the Krishna Yajurveda and the Rik Pratishakya, contain chapters which deal with speech production in general. For example, the Taitiriya says, Atha śabdotpattihi, and then goes on to speak of modifications of this śabda. Samvrite kantha, samvrite kanthe nadaha kriyate, vivrite shvasaha, madhyeha karaha, ta varna prakritayaha. That is, these are the basic constituents of speech sounds: nada, shvasa, and hakara, depending on how this airflow is modified as it goes through the kantha, the vocal, the glottal aperture. In addition, the Rik Pratishakya also describes in Partana 16 through 18 Vedic metrical structures, so that it deals with chandaḥ. And some of what it says is matched in Pingala's Chanda Sutra. On the other hand, Pingala's treatise is not limited to Vedic meters. Nor is Panini's śabdānuśāsanam, vyākaraṇam, which may be considered the prime representative of the Vedanga, vyākarana, limited to Vedic usage. Quite the contrary. Vedic usage here has the status of being exceptional. Paninian sutras do indeed oppose the domains of Lokika and Vedika usage, using the terms bhasha and chandas, bhashayam chandasi. But the bhasha is treated as the main object of description, with Vedic usage being the exception. This is historically appropriate, for the rules which apply in the bhasha also apply in general for Vedic, and Panini can enumerate, for example, particular verb endings that occur in Veda, such as tana and tana instead of ta, in imperative forms such as dadhatana instead of dhatta, an ending like masi instead of mas, in forms such as dipayamasi instead of dipayamaha, and instead of, and the ma instead of in what we call first singular forms such as vadhim instead of avadhisham. Moreover, Panini makes clear that his information is different for the bhasha and Vedic usage. In the case of bhasha usage, he can state authoritatively where, including dialects, what applies, what operations apply where, including in certain dialects. But for Vedic, it is common that he uses the term bahulam variously, showing that the texts which came down to him did not suffice for him to state definitive distributions. Bahulam is traditionally said to apply as follows: Kvachit pravrittihi, kvachid apravrittihi, kvachid vibhasha, kvachid anyadeva. Vidher vidhanam bahudha samiksha, chaturvidham bahulakam vadanti. This is a great variation, showing that it is impossible to narrow things in this wide range of text that he has before him. Moreover, there are developments within Sanskrit, within the bhasha, such that that have not been carried out completely, such that Panini will say things such as anyesham api drishyate. This applies to other sounds, but he doesn't specify them. He simply says drishyate. We will come back to that in a moment. Now, reflecting this relative status of the Veda and the Lokika usage, when Patanjali specifies which correct forms constitute the domain of Panini śabdānuśāsanam, he names Lokika forms first. The Mahābhāṣya begins, atha śabdānuśāsanam. Athetyayan śabdaḥ adhikara artha prayujyate. Śabdānuśāsanam shastram adhikritam veditavyam. Then he asks, keshan śabdānaṁ? And the answer is, lokikanam vaidikanam cha. That is, the Lokika words come first. In addition, Patanjali gives 5 major compelling reasons, prayojanani, why grammar is to be studied. The question is posed, kani puna śabdānuśāsanasya prayojanani? And the answer is, raksho hagama lagha sandehaha prayojanam. Taken as a single whole, they are raksha, uha, agama, laghu, and asandeha. It is noteworthy that the first purpose given is the preservation of the Vedas, raksha. Only one who is informed about deletion, lopa, augments, agama, and sound modification, varnavikaraha, will preserve the Veda properly. Patanjali actually says, rakshartham vedanam adhyeyam vyākaraṇam lopagama varnavikara hi samyak vedan paripalayishyati. Now it's interesting to take one example of this. Kayata illustrates deletion and augmenting, lopa and agama, with one form, aduhra, which occurs in the Veda, instead of the Lokika form, aduhata, they milked. In terms of Paninian grammar, this involves several operations. The ta of the ending ata is replaced by 0, lopasta atmane padeshu. And the second a of the resulting element sequence is the single replacement for both vowels, atogune. In addition, the ending receives the initial augment root. And there we have a rule that says bahulan chandasi. That is that this augment occurs variously in chandas. Now it's interesting what Kayata says here is that someone who does not know grammar might commit the error of considering aduhra a wrong form. On the other hand, one who knows grammar recognizes that a form like aduhra has been explained by Panini and consequently knows that this is equivalent to the Lokika form, aduhata, and then he can determine what the Vedic text means and understand it. Now, Nagesha says something interesting there. The term that Kayata uses is bhramyet, might commit an error. And Nagesha glosses this and says, bhramena pathantaram kalpayet ityartha. In error, such a person might posit, kalpayet, a variant reading, a different reading. And this, of course, has to be avoided. That the proper maintenance of the Vedas is given first among the reasons for studying grammar is noteworthy. This places Vyakarana in a clear position as a Vedanga in the sense of a Vedopakaraka, something that helps the Vedas, keeps them from suffering corruption. Also important is that this shows that the Vedas were seen as possibly subject to modification and corruption. In this context, we should recall that after describing the properties of sounds and how they enter into sandhi, close junction, the Rikpratishakya devotes a chapter, Patala 14, to explaining faults, doshaha, of pronunciation that are viewed as the result of three major factors: adding a segment, aya, leaving out a segment, apaya, and changing the properties of a segment, yatana. In addition, the same text, Rikpratishakya, says that one should pronounce the three tones, udatta, anudatta, and swarita, in such a way that they are not confused. Asambigdhan. That where tone sandhi applies, one should pronounce the single vowel that is combined two tones, so that the tones are not pronounced separately. That one should not pronounce with kampa in a sing-song fashion, which Uvata attributes to Southerners, and that udatta and anudatta should not be pronounced so as to separate their qualities too much. That is, one should not make the udatta too high, nor the anudatta too low. Again, this shows that obviously some people were reciting the Vedic text in a faulty manner, and Shaunaka points these out to say that faults should be avoided. A mistaken usage could have drastic results, as it is illustrated by the well-known legend, which I will not repeat here, of Twashtri trying to gain vengeance against Indra. Indra had invaded his yagya, drunk up the soma. Twashtri takes what remains of the soma, pours it into the fire, and commands the fire to grow as he wants it to be the killer of Indra. He says, Indra Shatrur Vardhaswa. Now, he mispronounced the term Indra Shatruhu. He meant to use this as a Shashtitat Purusha, Indrasya Shatruhu, Shatayita, meaning slayer of Indra, with high pitch on the final vowel, samasasya, but he mistakenly kept the original udatta syllable of Indra, thus producing thus pronouncing a Bahuvrihi. Panini Sutras Bahuvriho Prakritya Purva Padam, meaning he whose destroyer is Indra. As the Maitrayani Samhita says, he wanted to make the fire Indra slayer, but he made him one whose slayer was Indra. Indrasya hainam shatrum achikirshat Indrasya shatrum akarot. Now, Patanjali alludes to this wrong usage in connection with the second supplementary reasons given why grammar should be studied, to avoid the use of corrupt forms. Now, this then becomes a lokika usage. That is, śabdānuśāsanam is that sadhu śabdaha and apashabdaha prithak pritaha sadhu śabdaha anushishyante. Correct speech forms are taught after being separating them from incorrect speech forms. And in order to keep merit, we should not use incorrect forms. Dushtan shabdan ma prayukshmahi ityadhyayam vyākaraṇam. Now, the first major reason given, Raksha, for protecting the Veda. The second reason also involves ritual and shifts the topic for us slightly. This concerns uha, modification of a mantra. Patanjali remarks that mantras are not recited in the Veda with all genders and vibhaktis made explicit. A participant in a ritual has to make appropriate modifications in them when they are used to accompany ritual acts. One who does not know grammar is not capable of modifying mantras appropriately. A standard example given is a mantra. For example, in the Darsha Purnamasa, the Adharyu pours out grains into the Shurpa, and he recites, Devasya tva savituh prasave, Shrinor bahubhyam pushno hastabhyam agnaye jushtam nirvapami. I pour you as something that is pleasing to Agni. Now, a comparable mantra is supposed to be used in offering a porridge, charu, to Surya. And this requires the uha, or modification of the mantra, such that instead of saying Agnaye jushtam nirvapami, you say Suryaya jushtam nirvapami, with Suryaya instead of Agnaye. Now, Patanjali's statement that only a grammarian is capable of making this change calls for comment, obviously. It is very difficult to argue that he means that only a student of grammar could know that the form Surya corresponds to Agnaye. Any person who knew and spoke the language would know this without needing a grammar to inform him. On the other hand, Patanjali can be considered and must be considered to say that only one who knows grammar also knows how these items correspond to each other formally. That is, Agnaye is composed of the base Agni with the ending E, Nge, before which the ending E of the base undergoes a replacement. In Paninian terms, Agni goes to Agne E, Gher Ngiti. Agne E goes to Agnaye, Echo Yava Yavaha. Similarly, Suryaya represents the result of Surya, followed by the ending E. Surya E goes to Surya, Surya Ya, with replacement of the ending by Ya, Ner Yaha. And then the final vowel of the base is replaced by a long vowel, Suryaya, Supicha. That is, we look at the Vedic forms formally now, in terms of their structure and how they are derived. And only a grammarian can do this and thereby appreciate how this uha takes place. This view is confirmed by what Patañjali says after naming and discussing all the compelling reasons for studying grammar. The question is posed, why is a group of reasons explained only to those who are embarked on studying grammar and not something else, such as a study of the Veda? The answer is that the matters nowadays are different from how they were at an earlier time. At an earlier time, the situation was such that Brahmanas would study grammar after going through the Upanayana ceremony. Then Vedic words would be taught to them once they had acquired in grammar a knowledge of the places of production, sthana, the articulators, karana, and the modes of articulation outside the vocal cavity, anupradana. Nowadays, that is in Patanjali's time, things are not that way. Once students have studied the Veda, they study the Veda first. They are in a rush to marry and so forth. And they are wont to say that for them, Vedic words are established from the Veda, mundane words from common usage. Patanjali says, tadadyatve na tatha, vedamadhitya tvaritavaktaro bhavanti, vedanno vaidikaha śabdaha siddhaha lokacha laukikaha anarthakam vyākaraṇam. Grammar serves no purpose because the Vedic words are established for us from the Veda. Laukika words are established to us from loka, from common usage. Now, this has to say that there was a laukika usage. That is, that the language that we call Sanskrit, Dandi called Sanskrit for the first time, and used what were called śabda and was referred to as bhāṣa, the spoken language, was indeed used as a vyavahara instrument, a means of communication at the time of Patanjali and Katyayana. Now, in the same vein, after remarking how reciting correct speech forms, pratipada patha, is clearly no means of allowing one to know all possible correct speech forms, anupaya, Patanjali states the theoretical foundation of Panini's grammar. One has to put into play a set of rules, lakshanam, that includes what is general and what is particular, samanya visheshavat, that is general rules and related exceptions. And this is next is important, whereby with a minimum of effort, students of the work could achieve an understanding, pratipadyeran, of great masses of correct speech forms. Patanjali says, kinchit samanya visheshavan lakshanam pravartyam yenalpena yatnena mahato mahata śabdaoghan pratipadyeran kimpunastat utsarga pavadau. Now, here again, to say that the students learn these things is not the proper approach, given that the loka already use the correct speech forms. They now learn the structure of these forms, how they are derived, the utpatti of the forms. In connection with this, we have to consider that what Katyayana says, he says, Shastra purvake prayogya abhyudaya statulyam veda śabdena. There is abhyudaya, merit or felicity, in the use, prayoga, of correct speech forms, Shastra purvake prayoge, in the use that is preceded by the Shastra, the grammar. And he mentions that this is comparable to what is done in the Veda. And Patañjali supplies an example for that. He says, Tattunyam Veda Śabdaha api evam amhivadanti. Yognishtomena yajeta ya uchainam evam Veda. It is not sufficient if you're going to get the rewards of a yajna. It is not sufficient that you perform the agnishtoma and such, but that you know why this is performed. That this is why the Brahmanas give the legends explaining the background of the rituals. It is not just Katyayana and Patanjali who assume a spoken language as a source of knowledge about the language itself and informing the grammar. We have to assume that Panini took the same attitude and had the same situation. We also have to consider that Panini compiled his śabdānuśāsanam as a work to be studied by native speakers of the language he described. Thus, there's a sutra, very famous one, that says, Prishodaradini yathopadishtam. This says that items like prishodara are considered correct speech form, speech usage. And this sutra uses the term yathopadishtam, yatha upadishtam. This term cannot mean as taught in the grammar, since the items in question are precisely such that no rules of the Ashtadhyayi formulate operations that account for them. For example, no rule provides for deleting the ta of prishat before udara so that you get prisha udara and therefore can get prishodara. Therefore, we must accept what Paniniyas, such as the Kashika, say concerning this. The Kashika says, Yeshu lopagama varna vikaraha shastrena na vihitaha drishyante cha tani yathopadishtani sadhuni bhavanti. Yani yathopadishtani shishtaihi uccharitani prayuktani tani tathaiva anugantavyani. The items in question are to be accepted as you find them. Yathopadishtam, yathashishtaha, tani shabda rupani, ucharayanti prayunjate, tatheva tani svikartavyani. This is the thrust of it. This also accords with a series of rules where Panini says certain operations are seen, trishyante, that is, one can witness them. Elsewhere, he says, anyasya, anyesham, anyatra. That is, Panini himself cannot specify where these apply because the developments that lead to these forms have not come to their end. How do we know where they apply? The commentators tell us, go see what the shishtas say. The shishtas are the ideal speakers. Now, this method that Panini adopts to describe the language also links him to his Vedic antecedents. This is again well known. As is well known, Panini derives final utterances starting with posited underlying utterances, alokika vakya, in which affixes, pratyaya, are introduced after bases, prakriti, under conditions which include particular meanings, to give syntactic padas, suptingantam padam. And then these padas are, from the beginning, linked to each other semantically and syntactically. Operations apply to these which lead ultimately to final utterances used in linguistic interchange. Laukikani vakyani. This has a parallel in Vedic, as everybody knows, where the Samhita Patha is theoretically treated as a result of applying phonological rules, modifying posited underlying padas in the Padapatha. And the Rik Pratishakya says, Pada Prakriti is Samhita. This has to be taken as a Pada Prakriti here has to be taken in the sense of which have the Samhita is a Bahubri here. The Samhita has the Pada as its Prakriti. The main contrast between this and Panini's system is that the latter does not start from padas as given items. Instead, they are formed from bases and affixes. So if the Padapatha will give something like Agnim, Ire, Pura, Hitam, Panini will give Agni, Ida, I. That is, the pada is and further analyzed. Now let me end by considering briefly some relations among Vedangas. Recall that Patañjali speaks of an early time at which Vyakarana preceded Vedic instructions and that students subject to the latter knew places of production and so on from the former. This means, as Nagesha notes, that at one time śikṣā was included in Vyakarana, in the domain of Vyakarana in general. Thus, Patanjali thus couples śikṣā with Vyakarana. And indeed, Panini presupposes the phonetic knowledge imparted by śikṣā when he says, for example, tulyasya prayatnan savaranam. He does not tell you what the sthanani are. He does not tell you what the abhyantara prayatnas are. He doesn't go into that. He assumes you know it. Yaska also acknowledges the relation of nirukta to vyakarana when he says, tadidam bibhyasthanam vyakaranasya kartsnyam swartha sadhakancha. The field of knowledge called nirukta is a complement of vyakarana. It completes it, kartsnyam. And it also serves its own purpose. This purpose of its own is explaining meanings which do not accord with the grammatical structure of words used in a mantra, where the accent and grammatical formation of a pada, a swara, and sanskara are congruent, samartha, with the meanings and match the action denoted by the verb. One simply explains the word in the manner dictated by the structure and in accordance with vyakarana. It says, athanirvachanan tad yeshu shabdeshu swara sanskarau samarthau pradeshikena gunena anvitau syatan tatha tani nirbruyat. For example, if the mantra in the Rig Veda contains the form trataram, protector. One simply lets that be explained as grammar does it. It is the base tra plus the suffix trich, since it is antodata. And the meaning accords with that. Yaha trayate sa trata, because nul trichao are krit suffixes and kartari krit, they signify agent. Where these conditions are not meant, one still must supply an etymological explanation for the word in question. And Yaska goes into quite a detail on the different techniques to be used. I take the simplest one to start. For example, he says first, by the means of some meaning function, some meaning similarity. For example, pakva means cooked. As a regular formation, this involves taking the dhatu pach, letting it be followed by the ending ta, kta. Now this then undergoes certain operations. The cha goes to ka, chofkuhu. The ta goes to va, pachovaha. Moreover, kta regularly follows a verbal base if an action is referred to the past, nishtha. On the other hand, cooked, with past reference does not fit the meaning of pakvam. In the mantra, Rig Veda 689.7, speaking of Indra, amasu pakvam eiraya asuryam ruhayo divi. Excuse me, I don't recite Veda with the proper swaras. I've never been trained in that. Now this has to mean, Indra, you put milk, pakvam, in cows, amasu. Now pakva here does not mean cooked. It means milk, according to every traditional interpretation, including Westerners also. Nevertheless, one explains the use here, pakva, by virtue of meaning affinity. As food referred to as pakva is consumed, bhujyate, so is milk that is found in cows. This is the semantic link and allows you to understand what is meant. Now, before he characterizes nirukta as a complement to grammar, Yaska also insists that without nirukta, there is no proper understanding of the meanings found in mantras, and that one who lacks this understanding cannot specify the proper accent and grammatical formations of words. The accent and the proper formation. He says, Athapi inamantarena mantreshu arthas pratyayo na vidyate. Arthama pratiyato natyantam swara sanskaro deshaha. That is, to describe the words of a mantra properly, one has to understand what they mean. And one can do this according to this, and one can reconcile this with the structure or resort to etymological explanation. Now, in Panini's system also, meaning serves as a condition, nimitta, for introducing grammatical units and performing operations on them. However, there's a difference between this procedure and what Yaska has in mind. For Yaska, the ultimate meaning of a word understood through the procedure of nirukta involving the association of actions with the meaning of nouns serves to interpret utterances. He is given the Veda. He is given the Veda, the Vedic text with mantras. These mantras contain certain difficult words to explain, nighantu. They are then given an etymological explanation. For Panini, meanings are conditions that serve to condition operations whereby utterances are derived. Nevertheless, the proper structural understanding of utterances and their constituents can and do serve a purpose with respect to the Veda, as noted above. Thus, we may view these and related Vedangas from two perspectives: performance and interpretation. VYAKARANA deals with the structure of utterances treated from a speaker's point of view. It starts with the Bhaktur Vivaksha, what the speaker wishes to express. Śikṣā deals with the pronunciation of the segments in such utterances that are derived. Chandaḥ deals with the metrical organization of utterances, namely mantras, as used in ritual performance. All of these have to do with performance. Nirukta deals with an exegetical side. And from this point of view, nirukta then not only links with vyakarana, but very closely links with purvamimamsa, which again is an interpretive system. It is an exegesis of Vedic mantras to determine the proper viniyoga in the ritual. And you can see this opposition in terms of metalinguistic principles. In grammar, you have certain decision principles. Purva para nityantaranga pavadanam uttarottaram baliyaha. In Mimamsa, it's the reverse. You have Shruti Linga Vakya Prakarana Sthana Samakhyanam Samavaye Para Daurbalyam Arthavi Prakarshat, and that gives you the clue. Why? Because the meaning intended, the understanding of the meaning is further removed as you go out. You have first the Shruti, the word itself, and the Vibhakti itself tells you the function of the word and tells you how to use that element. So you have this one. My main conclusions are: one, the Veda certainly was the text that was at the source of all of this. That very text, however, was recited by people who spoke Laukika Sanskrit, and that text was subject to modification and corruption. Hence, raksha was needed, protection of the text. Two, there was a Laukika usage which was used in Vyavahara. You cannot deny that Sanskrit, that it was not simply, as some people have claimed even nowadays, that what Panini describes is somehow a Paninian Sanskrit. No, he is describing an object language which was used in actual communication. And thirdly, these systems that are devised can approach these materials from two major points of view. One, the performance view, and one, the interpretational view or exegesis. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor George Cardona. Wonderful paper. As usual, you have cracked so many stones, hitherto not broken, and so many microscopic elements which were undigested till was made it very clear. And it's a very, very excellent paper, research paper. And I congratulate you for finding time to prepare such an authentic paper, quoting several acharyas, and giving a very multidimensional what we call nature of the subject, and how you connect with all these things. That is very normally it is very difficult. So it is a very good paper and very enlightening paper. And I thank you for
Thank you.
finding time to come over on the virtual platform and present this paper. I feel that after giving the lecture, you are becoming more young, very, seemingly very happy. So what you could deliver, that you have delivered. So thank you for your presentation.